and recognized here in the United States as a time to remember and highlight the contributions and sacrifices of Africans in America. Today, I come to take us on a little journey. We don't have to go very far from here. We're going to go exactly around 2 miles from here. It's a cold January day. It's January 16, 1865. It's Savannah. It's full of African people. As a matter of fact, the 1850 census said that the population of Africans in Savannah was at 40%. But that was the census, and you know how we are about a census. So if they say it was 40, it was probably double that, right here in Savannah. The country was in a real war, with real guns, with real bloodshed. There were no televisions, no phones, but there was press, and the press had gotten hold to some very interesting information. They were reporting on the war efforts of the time, and they found out about this horrific incident that had happened in Georgia in November of 1864. And because of the bad press of that incident, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, came to Savannah to investigate what happened. The African communities were dealing with finding safe spaces for their relatives who had come from plantation life to the city of Savannah looking for work and places to live. They didn't trust the Union or the Confederate soldiers who were in town mingling with the European citizens while waiting for Sherman's marching orders. Because at any time, whether they were free men and women or formerly enslaved captives or escapees, they could be accused and potentially captured again, because even though the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued 2 years prior to this time, many planters and businessmen in Savannah ignored the proclamation. The word had spread throughout Savannah about the tragedy at Ebenezer Creek, which was a stark reminder that the bodies of African people meant nothing to either side of the war. As my imagination wanders to 1865 Savannah, I realized that my great-great-grandmother could have been somewhere right around in here at one of the many churches that existed during that time. My great-great-grandmother was probably at somebody's church, maybe even somewhere around these grounds, praising and thanking God that change had come. And maybe even helping the church accommodate those Africans who had come to Savannah looking for food, housing, and work as newly free men and women. I wonder about things like my 15-year-old great-great-grandmother, who would have been wearing, I don't know, definitely a dress, and maybe a dress with but lots of buttons down the top front, and then maybe like A-line skirt, right? She probably had braids, maybe 3 or 4 braids in her hair, and probably a wrap around her head. Her name was Ellen. I wonder if Ellen hoped that one day her great-great-granddaughter would be calling her name at a podium her daughter how to deliver a baby? Probably, huh? Yeah. Her daughter, my great-grandmother, Lila, was a midwife who delivered hundreds of babies in South Carolina. But many of the records of the births and the deaths in Hampton County, where she lived, were destroyed in a fire of the county courthouse in 1880. How convenient. No census records, no sales records, no birth or death records of millions of people just gone. The only people that still have those types of records are the descendants of families that were able to secure their family records in family Bibles, in their home parlors, or even in formal family archives. But not many Africans had that luxury. Sometimes I wonder, wondering is a good thing to do. It makes you ask questions. And it's okay to ask questions. I know many of us were trained not to ask questions. But today, our children ask a lot of questions. And all they have to do is type their questions, and they get answers. All we have to do is type the question and get answers. Let's keep asking questions, because knowledge truly is power. So back to my story. It's 1865, 4 years since the bloody war started. A civil war. The Civil War. You know, the one that Nikki Haley said happened because the government was going to run about the freedoms of what people could and could not do. Or did she mean they fought for the right of states to do what they wanted to do? Does this sound familiar? Nikki Haley, let me help you with your answer. The federal government was concerned about whether the United States could survive the divisions that were existing over whether or not states could join the Union, or new states could join the Union, if they were or intended to continue practicing using Africans as free labor. State governments wanted the federal government out of their business. Sound familiar? They weren't talking back then about the women's right to choose versus the right to life in 1860. They weren't talking about whether to keep someone's name off the ballot in 1865. They were fighting over the illegal use of Africans as forced and unpaid laborers. Many state governments believed that if they agreed that any new states joining the Union could not have free labor of Africans, then their state's rights to own Africans would be in jeopardy. Just a few months before the war started, on July 9, 1860, a ship carrying 110 Africans captured in Benin, West Africa, landed in Alabama. And this happened even though the transporting of African captives on ships from Africa was supposed to have been banned for over 50 years. Although historians say that this ship, called the Cotilla, was the last known ship to sail from West Africa, what is not often told is that for 50 years prior to that, Africans continued to be captured and traded on what would be called the black market, with millions being captured and brought right here to Savannah. But when I tell you Savannah is Black history, Savannah is Black history. I mean, we had heard all about the Montgomery bus boycotts and Rosa Parks, the Martin Luther King March on Washington. We all know about Bloody Sunday and the 600 people attacked by law enforcement as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. We heard about these sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. But how come I'm just finding out about the sit-ins at the lady department store lunch counter? At first, I thought maybe it was because I went to school in New York. But if I knew about what happened in Alabama and in North Carolina, I certainly should have known what happened in Savannah. Apparently, Ralph Mark Gilbert and the NAACP voter drive were templates used in cities around this country. And the fact that Ralph Gilbert pastored the oldest Black church in America. And the work of W.W. Law and his commitment to preserving the history of African people in Savannah is a big deal. And as fate would have it, although the manual that we studied didn't include Taylor Square, but Calhoun Square, my husband and I got to witness just last Saturday, the unveiling of the new Susie King Taylor Square. Yes, her story paints a beautiful picture of the resistance, ingenuity, and persistence that Africans in America's Savannah embody. And the song, Wade in the Water, has an added meaning for me. After finding out about the wade-in protests at Savannah beaches. Because of these protests and many others, Savannah desegregated itself. And they did it 8 months before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, so in a minute, I'm going to take us to Second African Baptist Church, exactly 2 miles from here. At that church, Martin Luther King recited the lines of his I Have a Dream speech before the March on Washington. But if you know like I know, he preached it at that church. And I'll just go on and say, Martin Luther King practiced his I Have a Dream speech on the folks in Savannah first, and then went to Washington, D.C. and pulled it up. Okay, so here's the story. On December 9, 1984, as the Union troops marched from Atlanta toward Savannah, they came across a body of water called Ebenezer Creek. But by the time they got there, thousands of Africans called refugees who followed behind the troops for safety and security, hoping for lives free from European oppression and forced labor. The Union General, General Jefferson Davis, made a fatal decision to remove the platoon bridge that the troops had just crossed over, causing over 5,000 African civilians to die by drowning. And the ones that did not drown were caught by the Confederate Army. By the time they arrived in Savannah, the press and the public outcry over what happened was enormous. So the Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton, came to Savannah to find out what happened at Ebenezer Creek. But when he got here, he found a bigger problem. Savannah was full of, quote, refugees and local Africans who were looking for work, housing, and food, while local African leaders were overwhelmed with the number of people in need. General Sherman and Secretary Stanton were desperate to find solutions to stabilize the city and protect it from Confederate military operations. Some writers say that Stanton suggested to General Sherman that they meet with the leaders of the local African community to discuss a solution to the problem, while others write that Sherman and Stanton responded to the demands of those leaders to meet. Nonetheless, they met with 20 African representatives from the community, mostly made up of Methodist and Baptist ministers. Garrison Frazier was selected by his fellow clergymen as their spokesperson, and he outlined 3 areas that needed to be dealt with. Number 1, they wanted to be free of the domination of white men. Number 2, they wanted to be educated. And number 3, they wanted to own land. Some say that it was Frazier that added the specifics to the land request, while others say it was General Sherman. What we do know is that 4 days after that meeting, General Sherman issued Field Order Number 15, which was approved by the newly inaugurated President, Abraham Lincoln. This executive order confiscated 400,000 acres of abandoned coastal property from Charleston to Jacksonville, Florida. And as far inland as 30 miles west from the coastline, which would be Jessup, Claxton, Statesboro, Brunswick, and Jacksonville. Just take a moment to think about the reaction of those who heard those words. The order was read on a Monday, so by that following Sunday, I could just imagine what church was like. The 400,000 acres would be divided into 40-acre plots and distributed per family. In addition to receiving land, men were encouraged to join the U.S. Army. Why? To support their newfound freedom. Sherman later announced in a separate order that families could also lease a mule from the United States Army, giving them 40 acres and a mule. To accomplish this distribution, on March 3, 1865, Congress passed an act to establish a bureau for the relief of the freedmen and refugees, to provide food, shelter, clothing, medical service, and land to the displaced Southerners, including newly freed African Americans. Within 6 months, 400,000 acres of coastal land was divided between 40,000 families. When that order was read, there was jubilee and there was lamentation. 3 months after the field order was read, and 1 month after Congress passed the Freedmen's Act, Lincoln was assassinated. And Vice President Andrew Johnson, who became president, repealed the order. And this created a serious crisis. Many Africans over the following year would be evicted from the land by force, while still many Africans held fast to the ownership of that land that they acquired, and they held fast by any means necessary. Johnson's repeal caused many of those newly freed people to have to work as sharecroppers and domestic workers on some of the very plantations that they had left, which set the stage for the systematic disenfranchisement of Africans, and not just here in Savannah, but all across the United States, during the Reconstruction era, during the Civil Rights era, and even today. The 40 acres in the mule land distribution plan was not a new idea. It had been done here in Savannah before. When Oglethorpe arrived here in 1773, the European settlers that came with him during his several trips back and forth to England were given 50 acres each per family to start their new lives here in the New World. They got bootstrapped. So, like Martin Luther King once said, it's all right to tell a man to pull himself up by his bootstraps, but it's cruel to tell a man with no boots. The true freedom of African American people is inextricably tied to our economic freedom. So I'll leave you with this, Mommy. You over there going on that. I'll leave you with this. Almost. Y'all know my mother, right? Oh my God. Everyone in this sanctuary is evidence of the resistance, ingenuity, and persistence that Africans in America and Savannah's America embodies. Every once in a while, stop and wonder. Walk the streets of the beautiful squares in this city, especially Taylor Square. I believe that it's no coincidence that Pastor Shannon invited me to speak today. So I thank you for this opportunity. And maybe one day soon, you'll all be taking a tour with us of Savannah whenever we get this together.